Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about morality again, about whether morality is relative or objective. Last time we looked at different ways of thinking about the nature of morality, the distinction between moral objectivism and moral skepticism, and then we divided moral skepticism in three different categories. And the point of laying down the different ways of being a moral skeptic is to understand the different ways of denying that morality is objective. And because moral skepticism is defined as the negation of moral objectivism, any reason that we have in favor of one is going to be a reason against the other. In other words, any argument against moral skepticism is going to be an argument in favor of moral objectivism in the reverse. So for today, we'll be looking at reasons for thinking that moral skepticism is false, or at the opposite side of the same coin, different reasons for thinking that morality is objective. So think of yourself as an investigator, as a detective, as a theorist, and you're looking at the data. You're looking at your experience as a moral agent, your upbringing as a person, and crucially, your ability to reason about these subject matters. And ask yourself, what reasons do I have for thinking that morality is subjective or relative? And what reasons do I have for thinking that it's subjective? What's the most reasonable way of thinking about the nature of morality given the data or the evidence available to me? And in this section, I will use some of the Ross's reasons for thinking that the most reasonable way of thinking about morality is that it is objective. It's not subjective. So let's look at some of the main reasons, some of the main objections for thinking of morality as relative. The first one is the possibility of moral error. In other words, it seems that we can make mistakes, morally speaking. We can have false beliefs about morality. And that's a datum. That's a fact. That's a piece of evidence that needs to be explained by any theory about morality. A theory about morality that fails to explain this fact, it's deficient to that extent. A theory of morality that accommodates, that makes sense, that can explain this fact, it's better off for it, right? So in being able to explain the possibility of moral error counts in favor of a theory being the right theory of morality. And Russ points out moral skepticism or relativism fails to make sense of the fact that we make moral mistakes all the time. So the only kind of moral error that is allowed by the relativist is misunderstanding the moral code of the land. So go back to the example that I gave you last time. In Spain, people don't want to have abortions. It's against the law. Let us suppose it was when this book was written. I have not looked it up yet. But let us suppose that the society in Spain is one in which abortions are outlawed. According to relativism, what's moral within the territory of a land is what the culture deems to be moral. So Spain, let us assume, has deemed that abortions are immoral. According to relativism, that suffices for it to be immoral for people in Spain to have abortions. People in the US, on the other hand, abortions are legal here. They're accepted here. So let us just assume that, there's dispute about it, of course, but let's ignore that fact for now. Let's just make it simple. Let's assume that everyone's on board, that abortions are accepted. That's the code that we live by. According to the relativist, then morality would be moral here. Here's what the objection points out. If there were the one or two people that disagreed, that they thought, hey, they might be in Spain and say, hey, abortion is perfectly permissible. The whole country is mistaken. Or here, someone might say, hey, like abortion is not morally permissible. The whole country is mistaken. The kind of error that person would have, according to the relativist, would be a very basic one. It would just be misunderstanding the code of the land. They would fail to realize that the fact that the society endorses something suffices for it to be moral for the society. But of course, that's false, right? Of course, it is not the case that that's what the lone rebel is saying. What they're saying is not that they misunderstand what the code is. They know perfectly well what the code is. What they're saying is that the code is mistaken, that there is the possibility of the society making an error, and in fact, that they have made the error in this case. And we don't have to settle whether it is the society or the individual who's right, but here's what we know. It is possible to make errors. It is possible to make mistakes. The whole society could be mistaken about a moral realm. That's the datum to be explained. And relativism is incapable of explaining that. If relativism is true, it is impossible to make a moral error, because to be moral just is for it to be accepted by the society, the relativist society. So societies cannot make mistakes. But of course, this is false, right? Like, we have made mistakes. Societies make mistakes all the time. We can look at our own history and look at the time in which the US had slaves, that allowed slaves, thrive in slavery. And it permitted slavery. It was built into the Constitution. It's not that people were violating the rules or the norms and they were having slaves anyway. No, it was built into the very systems. Having slaves was permissible. Now we, looking back, say, we in the past made a moral mistake. Not only is it possible for people to make mistakes as a society, it happens all the time. Look at history and you can tell when people made moral mistakes. And that only makes sense. That judgment, that observation about a society having made a mistake only makes sense if morality is subjective. If there's this standard of morality that is not of our own making, not that result of human activities and thoughts and actions and words. And that standard is not being that's people's judgments are not faithful to that standard. There's a mismatch between the objective standard and the way things are. Or think about women and the ability to vote. In the US, that's a relatively recent development. And again, we think justifiably that that's an improvement, that people in the past were mistaken about not allowing women to vote because women have the same rights as men, we think, justifiably. And that in the past, people made a mistake, moral mistakes. But again, that only makes sense. All the story I'm just telling you about mistakes only makes sense if there's an objectivist standard of morality. And the mistake is the misalignment between your view or the view of your society in that independent standard. If there are just standards of society with no independent standard, if they're just things we do, activities we make, there's no making mistakes because there's no standard to compare it to in the mismatch. So the possibility of moral error is the fact that counts against thinking of morality as relative. And by the same token, a fact that counts in favor of thinking of morality as objective. It is only the objectivist view that makes justice to the possibility of moral mistakes. Here's another similar kind of objection. It is the moral equivalence objection. It says that if relativism or subjectivism are true, then everyone is in the moral part. Everyone who's playing by the rules of the society is doing the right thing. So if relativism is true, everyone's on the par. Everyone who's playing by the rules of the society is doing the right thing, precisely because the rules of the society are what settles what's moral for them. So think of the two pictures I have here. Think of Mother Teresa helping the poorest of the poor, dedicating her life to bringing about happiness, especially when most needed, where it's most needed. And think about the other picture I have, Hitler, someone who dedicated his life to, establish the white superior race, killing those that were not, white. According to relativism, it follows that they're on the same par. She was following her Christian culture of recognizing the dignity of the vulnerable, and it was right for her culture to believe that. So she was doing the right thing. So far, so good. But Hitler, it turns out, especially after he convinced people, that he was also playing by the rules of his Nazi culture, right? He was doing the thing that Nazi culture approved of. The code of the land was to establish a superior white race and to kill those that get in the way. That's exactly what he was doing. So by the relativist own standards, there is no way of telling apart who's morally better, Mother Teresa or Hitler. If morality is relative, Hitler was doing the kind of thing that was moral for him, and Mother Teresa was doing the kind of thing that is moral for her. They're on the par. They're on the same level. There's no way of saying that one is objectively better than the other. They're the same. But here's what Ross says. If I know anything about morality, I know that Mother Teresa is good, virtuous. Helping the needy, helping the poorest of the poor is a good thing. That's what good people do. Killing people because I'm not white, that's bad. If I know anything about morality, I know those two things. So Hitler is not on the moral par with Mother Teresa. She is much better. She's worthy of being imitated. He's not. He's worthy of being afraid of and put him in prison or something. But anyway, this conclusion, this implication of moral equivalence counts against the relativism. Why? Because clearly they're not equal, right? She is good, he's not. And if you're a relativist, you have to say your view entails that. You're committed to saying that they're on a par. But that's a clear kind of stab against, objection against taking the relativist view seriously. Surely they're not. Of course they're not. But that's not the case. They're not equivalent. Therefore, we have a reason for thinking that relativism is false. Here's another related. Oh, these objections are very related. If you get a handle on one, you can see how the other ones go. So objection 3 is that moral progress is impossible. If morality is relative and what's moral just is what the code of the land, what the society has determined to be moral for itself, then when it changes something, it doesn't really improve, it doesn't get worse, it just changes because there's no independent moral standard that is approximating, that is getting closer to you. There's nothing independent of the culture. I mean, that's what the view says. So if we think of moral progress as some one person or some individual becoming morally better, there's no such thing if relativism is true. But this seems false as well. And it's not only possible that there's moral progress, it happens everywhere. There's moral regress as well, and there's moral progress. So again, if we look at the examples we looked at before, the transition in our society from permitting slavery to not permitting slavery, from not permitting women voting to permitting women to vote, to having more equal standing, those transitions, we justifiably think of something good, something positive. We became a better society for having changed in that way. If morality is relative, however, people that enslaved others weren't doing nothing wrong. If morality is relative, people that prevented women from voting were not doing anything wrong. They were, in fact, doing the right thing, because at that time, that was the moral code of the land. Women were not considered equal. They could not vote. So there was no right of women that was being violated by those that did not permit them to vote. In fact, they were doing the right thing, according to relativism. Why? Because the right thing for them just is what the society says it is at the time. And at the time, not voting was what was allocated for, what was, how women were treated. And according to relativists, that's what was right for them. But that's false, right? Like, transitioning from not allowing women to vote to recognizing their equal standing in society and permitting them to vote, to have political power, to hold offices and so on, that's good. There is a kind of moral progress. But that story of moral progress only makes sense if morality is subjective. If you think morality is relative, you must say that the transition from not voting to voting, being capable of voting, from slavery to no slavery, those were just changes of code. There was no improvement in society as a whole. If relativism is true, there's no moral progress. It was just a change in ethical code. What was wrong at one time became right at a different time, and so on. And that just does not seem to be the way that we moral agents experience moral reality. It was progress. And the only way of making sense of that is objectivism. Here's a different kind of objection. So the first three kinds of objections seem similar, they kind of intertwine. This fifth one is different. It's actually using intolerance. Traditionally, people have, historically, sociologically, people have endorsed the relativistic language as a way of promoting tolerance, as a way of acknowledging differences without judging. And that's, of course, great. Tolerance is good. But notice what I just said. Tolerance is good. Tolerance is itself a moral ideal that transcends culture. To become a more tolerant society is good. To move from being an intolerant society to a more tolerant society is a kind of moral progress, because the moral ideal of tolerance is being instantiated or manifested by the society. That one does not want to be intolerant and want to build a society that is not that is tolerant, that is not intolerant, is something that can only be made sense by a morally objectivist perspective. Tolerance as something to be aspired to only makes sense if you're an objectivist. If you're a subjectivist or a relativist, you must say, you're committed to saying that a society that is intolerant, like the colonialist, imperialist, were doing nothing wrong. In fact, they were doing the right thing when they were imposing their cultures upon others and, taking their resources and abolishing their traditions. They were doing the right thing because according to their culture, that's what they should be doing. So being intolerant was for them the right thing, you must say, if you're a relativist. But here's what Ross wants you to think. But of course it was not. They were doing something wrong. Breaking the traditions of the others, being intolerant was something that they were doing wrong. So that only makes sense if you're an objectivist. Doing justice to the fact that intolerance is wrong only makes sense if objectivism is true and if relativism is false. So another point in favor of objectivism. It makes sense of intolerance being bad. One cannot be a relativist and think that tolerance is good. It can only be good for you. And someone who's intolerant is fine because that's them. So tolerance counts in favor of objectivism, not against it. Here's the final objection, is arbitrariness. In some sense, this is the deeper objection. And it says that if relativism or subjectivism are true, morality is arbitrary, is grounded in nothing. So if morality is relative, all moral judgments, Mother Teresa's virtuous, living in a society in which people are treated with respect as just, all of those moral judgments are morally arbitrary. There are no reasons for one judgment or the other. There's no ground for reasoning, for dialogue, for advancement. Why? Because there are no more facts to reason about. So there is no reason for any moral judgment that is grounded in the object of those judgments. So go back to the Mother Teresa example. I am an objectivist, can say things like, Mother Teresa is virtuous because she helped the poor. Notice that that's my reason. Helping the poor is good. She is to be judged, to be regarded as virtuous precisely because she has this quality. She helps the needy, the poor. And that's the reason, right? The reason why she's good. If you're a relativist, all of those moral judgments are relative. They cannot be part of what justifies judgments. To say that Mother Teresa is virtuous, if you say so, cannot be grounded in her and anything she does, because those would be objectivist terms. It has to just be the way in which you decide to speak, the way in which you as a society decide to structure itself. But it's arbitrary. Deep down, there's no reason for one treating helping the poor as just or unjust. And what Ross wants you to think is, that's ridiculous. Of course, helping the poor is good. Hurting the poor, hurting anyone, especially the most vulnerable, is bad, is vicious, is cruel. If I know anything, I know that. But all of that only makes sense if morality is objective and grounded in something in the real world. For the purpose of our class, this matters a lot. Moral dialogue as the kind of dialogue that you engage with an interlocutor to trying to figure out how to structure society only makes sense in an objectivist world, when you have this pursuit of the right way of arranging society, what a just society looks like. If there are no such facts to be discovered by the inquiry of moral dialogue, there is no point to dialogue. It's arbitrary. And the only thing that we have left is shouting at each other. It's just shouting your perspective louder and louder. If you look at some developments in the political sphere, you see that people have endorsed the relativist perspective. They no longer try to reason with each other. They just shout louder and louder, try to get a larger crowd of followers that shout. But that's recipe for disaster, right? That's recipe for undoing the progress we've made so far. That's recipe for ending the civilized society. And that follows from relativism. It takes an objectivist perspective, conception of morality, to think that there's a point to dialogue, to think that there's a point to try to investigate how to build our society based on moral facts that we discover and use as a way of making sense of our surroundings. But okay, let's end there. Those are the reasons for thinking that morality is subjective. There are more in the book if you can take them seriously. From this point onward, we will be assuming that morality is objective, and the readings we'll be doing will be on the basis of trying to figure out what the right view is, with the assumption that there is a right view and that we're not just making it up. So think about these reasons. Hopefully you're in agreement with that. But if nothing else, understand that that's the game we'll be playing from now onward. We're trying to figure out, assuming the morality is subjective, what's the right way of thinking about morality? What are the moral beliefs that capture or reflect or correspond to moral reality? Okay, let's end there. Until next time.